What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video. Today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, this is going to be a pet build that's also a heavy attack build. So this is basically going to be a build where you pretty much have infinite sustain up until execute. So the idea behind this is, as a heavy attack build, you don't have to worry about sustain. You're able to invest more in damage. You're able to invest more in max magic. You don't have to worry so much about your magic regen. So that's kind of the idea behind this build here, to kind of focus in on just doing as much damage as we possibly can. Because we're able to use heavy attacks and basically help sustain ourselves. An extra bonus of this build is that it also contributes very much towards minor vulnerability uptime because we are using 2 lightning staves. So this ends up being a pretty good option for Sorcs when it comes to both group utility as well as good DPS. Now there is one thing that I do have to caution you against, and that is that pet builds in general are not going to be able to be used in every single trial. It all is going to be dependent on the trial that you're able to use pets in, so you will still need to have a non-pet build for those trials. So for example, the mage in Ethereal Archive, you won't be able to use pets in that fight. So while this build does provide very good group utility with some good DPS, it also is kind of limited in which fight you're able to bring it into. So that's just something to keep in mind if you do intend on using this build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. So we're going to be talking about gear, our skills, our CP points, everything that we need to know in order to make this build happen. And I'll also be talking about some substitutions you might need to make depending on the specific scenarios. So starting off first with gear. So we are using Zaan, and this is kind of focused on, or I should say, assume that you're able to bleed at melee range and you don't have to move around a lot, so it's not a very mobile fight. So Zaan is still the strongest monster helm if you're capable of getting it to proc consistently. If you can't get it to proc consistently, then obviously you're going to need to switch out your helm. So 2 other helms that you're going to want to consider are going to be Skoria and Ilambris. So Ilambris does deal more damage than Skoria in general if you're able to get both the flame and shock damage. Now we do have a flame enchant, and I'll go over that when we get to our weapon enchants and things like that. But we will be able to proc both sides of Ilambris. So Ilambris is going to be stronger than Skoria. Skoria, on the other hand, is generally going to be a little bit weaker, but you're able to it has a max health as your one piece, that kind of cuts into your DPS a little bit, but that does mean you're not going to use a health enchant at all on any of your pieces if you do want to run a health enchant with Witchmother's potent Brew. A little bit more on food choice later as well. So some of these choices that I have in my build might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but I will explain everything when I get there. So Ilambris and Skoria are both going to be used when you can't consistently proc Zaan. In other words, you're going to the boss moving around a lot, or you have to play at range. Now each of them have their own uses as well. So Ilambris, the way the proc works is it spawns and it just hits wherever it procs. And as you can see here, it deals damage every 1 second for 5 seconds. So with the boss moving around, the Ilambris isn't going to be very useful because the proc is not going to damage it. That's when you want to use Valkyrie Skoria instead, because it just deals all of its damage in one blow. So that's kind of the situation here when it comes to monster helm sets. So Zaan when you're melee and the boss isn't moving around a lot. Ilambris when you have to play range and the boss isn't moving around a lot. And Skoria if you have to play range and the boss is moving around a lot. So that's kind of when you would use each of the 3 different monster helm sets. Now for the 5-piece set, this is going to be a body set, so it's going to be active at all times. Going to go with Siroria. So this is a pet build, so I will explain this a little bit later on, why we're using Siroria instead of Necropotence. And so Siroria is still a very strong set here, especially if you can get all those stacks, really high average stacks. But if you're not able to maintain those high levels of stacks, then Necropotence is actually going to be your next best option. So Siroria is going to be great. You can use perfect or imperfect. The difference is that extra max magicka on the 5-piece, the imperfect versions would have that, but you can use either of them. But again, that's really only going to be best if you're able to maintain the stacks. If you can't maintain the stacks, then you're better off running Necropotence instead for that hefty max magicka boost there. So that's kind of the very short version of why we're using Skoria instead of Necropotence. Now, for our weapon sets, this is the set that's going to be on our front bar. I played around with a couple of different sets here. So obviously, since we're doing double lightning staves, Burning Spell Weave is kind of out of the equation here. So Mother Sorrow ended up doing very well overall, so you can stick with Mother Sorrow. I tried out a Net's Touch as well. Net's Touch did pretty decent, and then because we have a lot of shock damage, so Net's Touch ends up being very strong here. And if you don't have either of those sets, then you can go with Julianos instead. Mother Sorrow is going to be easier to obtain than Netch just because you're able to buy it off the guild traders. Netch ended up pulling very close to Mother Sorrow, but on average it was still a little bit shy of Mother Sorrow, so you're still going to want to use Mother Sorrow instead. Another set that you might want to consider using is going to be Moondancer. I personally wouldn't use it with Siroria just because you're doubling up on the Minor Slayer bonus, so you're basically losing one set bonus. But if you're running Necropotence instead, you might want to consider using Moondancer instead. That way you can maintain that Minor Slayer bonus. Now, the problem with Moondancer is the sustain buff, because it's a 50-50 chance you get either sustain or the damage buff. The sustain buff doesn't really help you too much as on a heavy attack build, so it's not going to be quite as useful as if you were running a spammable build. So you're going to kind of be at the mercy of the RNG gods as to whether you get that spell damage buff or not. It does rely on you being able to activate synergies every 30 seconds or so. So that's kind of the downside of running Moondancer, but you still manage to keep that Minor Slayer buff, so that's pretty nice to have as well. But usually Mother Sorrow is going to probably be the most consistent DPS set here. Now we are going with 3 spell damage enchants just because we're a heavy attack build, don't have to worry about sustain, so don't have to reuse any sort of Magicka regen glyphs here. Now again, you're running 1 Bloodthirsty and 2 Arcane. You can go with any real combination between Bloodthirsty and Arcane, so you can go 3 Arcane, 3 Bloodthirsty, 2 Bloodthirsty, 1 Arcane. It's all up to you. 3 Bloodthirsty is going to be the strongest combination, but the difference is going to be pretty small. It's usually around 1k DPS or so, so not that big of a difference. So if you want the extra resources, then go ahead and stick with Arcane. But yes, 3 Bloodthirsty is the strongest combination of those 2 traits. Our front bar here, we have an infused with a weapon damage enchant. And then for our back bar, we have an infused Maelstrom Lightning Staff with a flame damage enchant. So we're still sticking with the flame damage enchant, partly because we sometimes will use Ilambris. We do want a source of fire damage, so we have the flame damage enchant proccing every 2 seconds. Because Blockade will now proc our back bar enchant instead of our front bar enchant, so we're able to proc our flame damage enchant every 2 seconds, and that could also proc burning as well, so that's an additional source of flame damage. So we need that if we're going to be using Ilambris. And this build already has really good minor vulnerability uptime, so we don't really need to have that shock damage enchant here. Yes, the shock damage enchant does do more damage with the enchant itself, but if you include the fact that the flame damage enchant also includes burning, and you already get very good minor vulnerability uptime, the shock damage actually ends up losing out to the flame damage enchant. So stick with the flame on your back bar here. Alright, so that's pretty much all the gear here. So let's go over our character sheet. So I am a Breton. Bretons are actually not going to be the best if you're going to be running this specific build. If you're going to be running this build, the Altmer, the High Elves are going to be best because they get the highest bonus of shock damage. You get 4% additional shock damage, as well as flame and frost damage. They also get 9% additional Magicka regen, which is pretty nice to have. So Sorcs generally have really bad regen, so the Altmer 9% max Magicka regen really does help out there. They get 10% max Magicka. Now, you also might want to consider running a Dark Elf instead, the Dunmer. They get 9% max Magicka and 7% flame damage boost, 8% shock and frost damage boost. So yes, we are running 2 shock glyphs, shock staves here, so we have a lot more shock damage and flame damage, but you also got to consider your non-pet build for those instances where you're not going to be able to run pets. In those scenarios, double Inferno staves are actually going to be stronger than double Lightning staves for a non-pet build. So you might want to consider running Dark Elves instead. Yes, you will lose just a little bit of DPS, maybe like 1k, 1.5k or so overall as to your ceiling for this specific build, but on your non-pet build, you'll end up being a little bit stronger if you go with double Inferno staffs. If you decide to stick with double Lightning, then you might as well just stay as a High Elf. Breton, like I have here, It's not a bad choice either. They get 10% max Magicka and they get about 39-60 spell resistance, so you get a little bit of additional survivability, and they get 3% reduction to their Magicka cost, which isn't quite as strong as the Magicka regen from the High Elves, but it still does help out your sustain a little bit. Again, this is a heavy attack build, so we're not focusing too heavily on Magicka regen, but a little bit more on that later. 64 points in the Magicka. You can see here our health is perfectly fine with 16.3, so I am using Witchmothers right now. So I'll explain why I'm using Witchmothers in a little bit instead of blue food. But if we're using blue food instead, which gives us just max health, max Magicka, we'd be hitting about 17.1k max health. So there's really no need to put points into health, especially on a pet build, because you'll get about 12% additional max health. So you don't have to put extra points into health. If you want to, you certainly can. I would put no more than 10 points into health. At that point, you're kind of giving up a little bit too much in max Magicka, so you're giving up too much DPS in my opinion, but that's kind of what I would do. For Mundus, you can go with the Thief or the Apprentice. Because we're running the weapon damage enchant on our front bar now instead of our back bar, and we have higher uptime, the Thief and the Apprentice, the disparity between them has pretty much shrunk to almost nothing, so it really depends on what set combination you're running now, but the difference between them is very, very little. It's less than 1%, less than even 0.5%, I'd say. So it's really not worth like swapping back and forth. Just pick one and stick with it. Now I am using Witchmother's Potent Brew, and that's just because for trials at least, execute phase can be fairly long, and that's what's going to really eat into your Magicka. Because at that point you're going to be spamming Endless Fury or Mage's Wrath, your execute basically. So at that point, you're not really going to be heavy attacking anymore. You are light weaving your execute. So for a 60-minute dummy, execute's pretty short. It's only maybe like 20 seconds or so. But in after trials fights, it's going to be a little bit longer. So you might want to have a little bit of extra regen with Witchmothers. Up to you. You can run Witchmothers. You can run Clockwork Filet, which is basically a slightly stronger version of Witchmothers. So you can run that, but if you feel like your sustain is fine, then you can by certainly all means run blue food, max health, max Magicka food. You just will have to realize you're going to be losing out some sustain during execute phase. So you might end up having to heavy attack during execute phase, which is ultimately going to be a DPS loss. So I tested both foods and it ends up being pretty even in the end. Yes, the sustain, you really feel the sustain difference in execute, but if you're able to sustain it, it shouldn't be that big of a difference. So if you have very good support, like the orbs and worm, by all means, go ahead and use blue food. Now for our skill bars, let's start off with our front bar here. So for our front bar here, we have Daedric Prey, Shock Clench. You can go with Shock Reach if you'd like, but Shock Clench is going to be a little bit better. Volatile Familiar, so this is our pet. And the Fury, you can go with the other morph, Mage's Wrath if you'd like. It's kind of up to you which one you want to go for. Inner Light, and then the Storm Atro. This is going to be our single target ultimate. So if we don't need to cleave anything, we're going to stick with Storm Atro. We're just going to default to the Storm Atro. Not just because it's very good single target DPS, but also because that major berserk from the synergy. It really helps out your friends there, doing more damage as well as you, because it also give the Atronach major berserk as well. And for our back bar, this is where we put our shield. We will be using the Sword Shield, so Empowered Ward or Hardened Ward. Empowered will give you and your allies a little bit more sustain, gives you Mind Intellect. So I prefer going with Empowered just because, again, Sword Sustain does need help, and if you have any other swords that are running expandable builds, they'll really appreciate having that minor intellect. So this is where your shield would go normally. You have Liquid Lightning, you have to double bar the pet, Blockade Storms, and then Channel Acceleration. Now, if you're within melee range and you're using, Zaan, you can stick with Rearming Trap if you'd like. Kind of up to you. Channel Acceleration is going to be a bigger hit on your sustain because you're using your primary resource here instead of your secondary with Rearming Trap. But this is a heavy attack build, so we don't really have to worry about sustain too much. Channel Acceleration lasts for a longer period of time, so generally speaking, I would run Channel Acceleration over Rearming Trap in most scenarios. There's very few scenarios where I would not run Channel Acceleration. And then Thunderous Rage, again, for any fights where you need the additional cleave, so trash pulls or certain boss fights, you're going to be using Thunderous Rage instead of the Storm Atro when you do need that additional cleave damage there. Now let's go ahead and talk about our CPs. So the CP cap is 780, which gives us 260 points across each of the 3 different constellation types. The Starting off with the green CPs, nothing new here. 75 Arcanist, 75 Tenacity. You can push them up to 200 if you'd like. There's really there's enough, or 100 I should say. There's enough points now that you can do that and still have some pretty good left points, a good amount of points left over for other nodes. So you can go ahead and do that if you'd like, but you're a heavy attack build, so you don't really need the extra 1%. But it might be helpful if you on your non-pet build. I'm sticking with 75, 75. That leaves 110, which you can put in the remaining nodes, really however you'd like. So I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, 40 Warlord, or 30 Warlord, I should say, 30. Now for our blue CPs, I do want to mention now that this is kind of optimized around a good organized raid group. So you have a tank in Alkosh, you have tanks running Infused Crusher, you have a Stamplar or healers running Minor Breach Poisons. So depending on the specific debuffs and their uptimes on your specific group, you might need to put some more points into spell erosion than I have here. So you're going to kind of have to figure that out for yourself. With this particular CP setup, because pet builds have very good minor vulnerability uptime, because we're running Lightning Wall, we do have a lot of points in the Thaumaturge. We actually have 81 points in the Thaumaturge. You can drop this down to 75. Pet builds, especially heavy attack builds, you do want to try to maintain Exploiter just because off balance you're able to maintain it very well by yourself. So it's nice to have that additional 10% damage, plus a lot of your damage are dots. So the only sources of direct damage here are probably going to be your light attacks and Daedric Prey. So having more Thaumaturge is always useful. So if you want, you can drop this down to 75. You will lose that extra 1% damage and drop all your points out of Staff Expert if you'd like, and then and you can put them into spell erosion if you do need to put more points into spell erosion. Otherwise, you can drop Elfborn on 56. You can possibly drop Elemental Expert down 56 if you really do need to put that many points into spell erosion. At that point, though, you might as well just start running the Lover instead to get the penetration cap. It's up to you. As long as the math works out, as long as you're hitting penetration cap, doesn't really matter where your penetration is coming from, because if you're in the Lover, then you can take points out of spell erosion and put them into other CPs and kind of make up for that loss there. Now for our red CP, I should probably say what I have here. So for me, I have 61 Elfborn, 64 LE Expert, 17 Spell Erosion, 6 Staff Expert, 31 Master at Arms, and 81 in Thaumaturge. Now for our red CPs, this particular setup that I have here is going to be good for all trials. It's not going to be the best for mitigation for all the trials though. So for each specific trial, there's kind of a best CP for the most amount of mitigation. So you will need to shift points around if you feel like you are too squishy in some trials. Overall though, this setup is going to basically be very good for all the different trials. 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick Skin, 64 Hardy and Elemental Defender. That leaves 10 points, which you're going to put into Bastion for the Field Physician passive. If you're in a progression style guild, if you're in a more casual vet trial guild, then you will want to have Field Physician. You're going to be resurrecting a lot more, and having that damage reduction is pretty nice to have. If you're in a guild that pretty much runs for score, there's not a lot of dying going on, you might not want to do this. In fact, if you're in one of those guilds, you likely probably already know what you have to do here for your red CPs. So that's just really here for the progression people as well as the more casual vet trials players. Alright, so now let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. Our rotation here is actually going to be static, so it's pretty much always going to be the same. There's not going to be that much difference in our rotation at all, really. So I'm going to show you guys over here. Obviously, you're going to want to start your buff pre-buff with Challenge Acceleration, and you gotta have your pet up, obviously. I actually might summon my pet just because with the rotation demonstration, probably gonna kill the dummy here. So obviously buff up with Challenge Acceleration, and then you always want to do Liquid Lightning and then Blockade, just because with Liquid Lightning have a 10-second duration, Blockade has an 8-second duration. So if you cast Blockade and Liquid Lightning, you have 3 seconds left on Liquid Lightning. So that's not a big deal for a heavy attack build because, again, you don't have to worry about sustain. But it's nice to get into the practice of Liquid Lightning into Blockade, because if you do a non-pet build with a spammable build, then recasting Liquid Lightning too early will usually end up in a DPS. A bigger sustain hit and you do want to try to maintain your magic as best you can. So try to get into the habit of just going Liquid Lightning and then Blockade. And then we are running Daedric Prey with the pet. So you always want to start with the pet pulse before you do Daedric Prey. Pet pulse has an 8-second duration, Daedric Prey has a 6-second duration. So if you go the opposite way, you do Daedric Prey and then the pet pulse, you're losing about a second and a half of the Daedric Prey debuff on the enemy. So you want the full 6 seconds, that's why we do the pet pulse first and then a Daedric Prey afterwards. One thing I will want to point out here as well with Daedric Prey is that if you are running a non-pet build, you might want to consider running Haunted Curse instead of Daedric Prey, mainly because Haunted Curse is going to be a lot stronger on a non-pet build, and on a pet build like this, running Haunted Curse isn't that big of a DPS loss. So just take that into consideration. You don't have to run Daedric Prey. On a non-pet build, you can replace that skill with something else, but most non-pet builds will be running Haunted Curse, so you must just something to keep in mind if you are playing Max Orcs. So rotation, like I said, is static, so nothing really changes at all. We're just going to start with Challenge Acceleration, Liquid Lightning, Blockade, Pet, Daedric Prey, and then do a heavy attack, Clench, then do a second heavy attack. Again, heavy attack, Clench, heavy attack. That's pretty much rotation. You're just gonna keep on doing that. Now, of course, you're gonna have to re-up Challenge Acceleration at some point. So in those instances where you have to re-up Challenge Acceleration, just drop a heavy attack. So you'd basically be doing Liquid Lightning, Blockade, you do your pet, and then you would use Daedric Prey, or rather, you do something like this, then you use Challenge Acceleration, right? Then you swap over here, use your pet, Daedric Prey, do a heavy attack into Clench, and then drop that second heavy attack. So I'll show you how it works on the 6 million dummy, what I mean by that. So we will be doing 6 million dummy parts so you guys can get an idea of DPS's pulse in comparison to non-pet builds or other pet builds and the other classes in the game right now. So we will be using just the Storm Atronach because again, we default to the Storm Atronach as our primary ultimate. It's the best for single target and it does give the Major Wizard buff to an ally. So one thing that I do want to point out here is that when the Storm Atronach despawns, so when the duration timer is up and it has to basically despawn, it counts as an entity, which means you won't be able to DPS through the Storm Angel as it's despawning. So be careful with your Storm Angel placement. So you're always going to want to place it to the side of the DPS, not between the DPS and the boss. And because of that synergy, obviously you don't want to put it too far away from the DPS group either. So the best place to put your Storm Angel is always going to be to the side of the group. That way, if they need to get a synergy, they can just quickly hop over, grab it, and then pop back, and then the Storm Atronach, when it despawns, won't be in the way of anybody, so they'll still be able to do their rotation and everything without having to awkwardly just be like, why are my abilities not working? Alright, so with all that said, let's go ahead and get started with these parts here. We're starting off here. It's going to be a little bit awkward. We also have to maintain LE drain, so that's going to change our rotation by a little bit. Alright, so I'm going to have to re-up Challenge Acceleration. So cast Challenge Acceleration. Go to my front bar, actually drop the first heavy attack. So I generally always end on a heavy attack. So when I drop my heavy attack to re-up Challenge Acceleration, I drop the first one. Again, you have to re-up Challenge Acceleration. Drop the first heavy attack, but we do the second heavy attack. see here with Ellie Drain, it's just throwing off our rotation by just a little bit. That is an extra global cooldown that we have to take into consideration. Generally speaking, if you have to use an extra cooldown, you're just going to drop that first heavy attack. So then execute. I generally just drop all my front fire stuff, only keep up with lightning and blockade, and just spam my execute. So that was a little bit worse than what I would normally pull with it. So by a little bit, I actually mean quite a bit. So I only pulled 37.4. But let me pull up a parse that I did earlier when I was playing around a little bit. So this is closer to what you should expect to see. So about 40.7k is kind of what I've been able to pull highest with this particular build. So see here that light attacks still make up a very good portion of our DPS because we still are light attack weaving on our back bar, we're light attack weaving on our front bar still, so you still want to be able to light weave pretty decently well, but the lightning and Blockade of Storms, without going into it too much, your strongest dots here. Atro is very strong here. Pet Pulse, makes up a pretty good amount of our DPS, but it's only 5th in line here. And then of course you have everything else falling off after that. So I do want to point out here, for those of you guys who are probably typing away in the comments right now, why are you running Siroria and not Necropotence? This is why. So Storm Atronach, while it is considered a pet for passive stuff, it's not considered a pet in terms of how its damage is calculated. Because it's an ultimate ability, it scales off of spell damage, not or scales off of spell damage as well as max magicka. The familiar pulse does not. It scales off of max magicka, but not as well off of spell damage. In fact, the coefficient for spell damage is really, really low. However, it only does 7.7% of our DPS to pet pulse itself. So if we take a look here at familiar melee, this is the familiar's just normal attack. This does 1.3% of our DPS. So if we add those two together, that makes up 9% of our DPS. So I'm not saying the Necropotence is not good. The extra max magicka that you get from Necropotence does affect all of your abilities. However, if your argument for running Necropotence instead of Skoria is you have to buff your pet damage more, your pet damage here only makes up 9% of your total DPS. If we don't include Zaan, because Zaan is a proc, then it's actually only makes up 9 out of about 94% of our DPS. So it's a little bit a kind of like, well, it only makes up about 10% of our DPS. So, Siroria, buffs everything. And not only that, it gives us Minor Slayer as well, which, is a nice buff to have in trials. So that's why we're running Siroria instead of Necropotence, because, yes, pets do not scale off of spell damage very much, but in the grand scheme of things, when you take a look at the portion of DPS that's coming from familiars versus everything else that's affected by spell damage, you'll want the spell damage more. If you want to think of it in terms of max magicka versus spell damage, remember 10.5 max magicka approximately is 1 spell damage. So the 5-piece of Necropotence gives us about 300 spell damage. Siroria, on the other hand, gives us 600 if you're able to keep all stacks up. So that's why my personal cutoff is if I can't average more than 10-ish stacks on Siroria, or less than that, 8, because we have to take into consideration minor Slayer as well. That's when I'll swap over to Necropotence instead. But people kind of overplay how much damage the pet actually does in a parse, or even in a trial. So that's why we're running Siroria and not Necropotence. So hopefully this will kind of clear things up for you guys. So that's it for this build. If you guys have any questions or comments, if you want me to clear up the Siroria versus Necropotence disparity there. I will do another video looking at both of them, so you guys can actually see the numbers behind them, both in when you're in a melee, kind of like you're able to basically stack a bunch of Siroria, versus kind of like not so much, but you're still getting some decent stacks, versus like I have no stacks at all. I'll be doing a video on that later on, so just kind of comparing Siroria versus bringing Spellweave and Necropotence kind of thing. When you should use each set. So I'll be doing a video on that later on for you guys. But yeah, so that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.